Today, spaceflight is facing a huge problem. Every spacecraft carries a limited amount of propellant, and once it's gone, that's usually the end of the mission. Whether it's exploring deeper into space, changing orbits, or simply staying operational longer, everything is ultimately limited by one thing: fuel. That's why so many future missions, from sending astronauts to Mars to building orbital fuel depots to operating massive next-generation satellites, will eventually depend on one capability: transferring large amounts of propellant while already in space. And yet, despite how important that technology could become, investment in orbital refueling is still surprisingly small. It's almost as if everyone agrees it's important, but nobody wants to be the first to write the really big check. Well, almost nobody. SpaceX is doing the exact opposite. Their biggest gamble right now is the giant spacecraft named Starship, and a huge part of its future depends on mastering orbital refueling. Even more exciting, the company is aiming to prove it can actually pull it off this year. So, how exactly are they going to do it? How can they overcome all the challenges of the past and do something that's never been done before: transfer fuel between two giant spacecraft in space? Now, in-orbit refueling isn't exactly a brand new idea. We've actually been doing versions of it for decades. Space stations like Salyut 6, Mir, and even the International Space Station have all received regular deliveries of fuel over the years. So the concept itself isn't some crazy sci-fi fantasy anymore. The problem is, it's still a huge pain. Every refueling mission costs a lot of money, requires incredibly careful planning, and leaves almost no room for mistakes. Accidentally spilling fuel in your garage is annoying. Accidentally spilling rocket propellant while both spacecraft are flying around Earth at nearly 28,000 kilometers per hour? Yeah, that's a slightly bigger issue. So what actually has to happen to make in-orbit refueling work? There are really three big challenges. The first is the spacecraft themselves. Before you can even think about moving fuel, two spacecraft have to find each other in an ocean of empty space, slowly close the distance, dock without turning themselves into an expensive fireworks show, and then transfer cryogenic propellant without leaks. That means you need standardized fuel connections, autonomous docking systems, and navigation that's ridiculously accurate. We're talking about two vehicles moving at orbital speed while trying to line up with centimeter-level precision. The second challenge is orbital mechanics. Contrary to what movies sometimes make it look like, spacecraft aren't just floating around waiting for each other. Everything in orbit is constantly moving, and changing even a tiny part of your orbit costs fuel, what engineers call delta V. So mission planners have to carefully figure out where fuel depots should be placed, how servicing spacecraft get there, and exactly when the rendezvous should happen. Because if you're even a little late, your meeting point has already flown hundreds of kilometers away. Space is surprisingly good at making simple appointments incredibly complicated. And then there's the third challenge, one that sounds simple until physics decides to ruin everyone's day. How do you actually move liquid fuel around when there's no gravity? Here on Earth, gravity conveniently keeps liquids sitting at the bottom of a tank. In space, gravity basically clocks out of work. Scientists spent years trying to understand this. Many of the earliest experiments were performed in drop towers, where researchers literally dropped equipment from very tall towers to create a few precious seconds of weightlessness. Not exactly the most convenient laboratory, but hey, you work with what you've got. Those experiments quickly revealed a problem. Without gravity, the fuel doesn't stay near the outlet of the tank. Instead, it floats around randomly while gas bubbles mix into the liquid. That means the outlet can start sucking in gas long before the tank is actually empty, sometimes when there's still nearly a third of the fuel left inside. Needless to say, rocket engines are not big fans of drinking air. To solve this, engineers invented something called propellant management devices, or PMDs. Their entire job is surprisingly straightforward: keep the liquid where you want it, and keep the gas somewhere else. One common design is called a screen channel PMD. It uses an incredibly fine metal mesh. The tiny openings allow liquid fuel to pass through, while surface tension prevents gas bubbles from following. You can almost think of it like an extremely high-tech coffee filter. The liquid sticks to the screen, but the gas stays on the other side until the pressure gets too high. Multiple channels are placed around the tank so that at least one of them is always in contact with the fuel, regardless of how the liquid decides to float around. A great example is that NASA used this approach in the Space Shuttle's reaction control system. The second design is known as a vane PMD. Instead of fine screens, it uses thin metal plates called vanes. Thanks to surface tension, the vanes naturally guide the liquid toward the outlet without needing any moving parts. They're lighter, cheaper, and can continue working even if a few small gas bubbles find their way into the fuel. There's just one tiny catch. They only work properly in actual weightlessness, which means you can't fully test them on Earth. Engineers basically have to say, well, the math says this should work, and then wait until the spacecraft gets to space to find out if the math was having a good day. Thankfully, it usually is. The Viking orbiter successfully used this type of system decades ago. Some spacecraft even combine both ideas. The vanes first gather the fuel near the outlet, while the screen acts as one final checkpoint to make sure only liquid reaches the plumbing. It's basically teamwork, but for pieces of metal inside a fuel tank. Of course, there's another way to avoid many of these problems altogether. Instead of letting fuel float freely inside the tank, why not stop it from floating in the first place? That's exactly the solution Russia came up with for its Progress spacecraft. Since 1978, the Soviet Union, and later Russia, has refueled space stations routinely using Progress vehicles, supporting Salyut 6, Mir, and eventually the International Space Station. Their tanks contain a flexible membrane, or bladder, that separates the fuel from the pressurized nitrogen gas. As the nitrogen pushes on the bladder, it squeezes the fuel out just like toothpaste coming out of a tube. Since the gas never actually touches the propellant, it can't accidentally get pumped into the transfer lines. The fuel and oxidizer are also transferred separately, reducing the risk if a leak ever occurs. It might not be the flashiest engineering solution ever invented, but after nearly 5 decades of successful missions, it's pretty hard to argue with the results. Now you know how we've been transferring fuel in space for decades. But then Starship came along and basically said, what if we made this problem way harder? The biggest reason is the type of propellant it uses. Unlike spacecraft that run on storable fuels like hydrazine, Starship burns liquid methane and liquid oxygen. These are cryogenic propellants, meaning they have to stay ridiculously cold to remain liquid. And cryogenic fuels are, well, kind of drama queens. They constantly absorb heat from their surroundings, boil very easily, create gas as they warm up, and because they're much less dense than traditional propellants, you need much larger tanks to store enough of them. All of that turns what was already a difficult refueling operation into something significantly more complicated. Naturally, you might wonder why SpaceX doesn't just borrow the Russian approach and use flexible bladders inside the tanks. Unfortunately, physics has other ideas. Rubber membranes become brittle at cryogenic temperatures and can simply crack apart. Thin metal membranes survive a little longer, but after being cooled down and warmed up over and over again, they eventually develop fatigue cracks as well. So engineers had to start looking for completely different solutions. One idea was to store the propellant above its critical pressure. At that point, there's no clear boundary between a liquid and a gas. Instead, the propellant becomes what's known as a supercritical fluid, making it much easier to manage because you don't have to worry about liquids sloshing around or gas bubbles forming inside the tank. NASA actually used this technique to supply hydrogen and oxygen to the space shuttle's fuel cells, so the concept definitely works. The problem is scale. Building tanks strong enough to safely hold hundreds or even thousands of tons of propellant at those kinds of pressures would make them incredibly heavy. And in rocketry, adding weight is basically the engineering equivalent of voluntarily running a marathon while carrying a refrigerator. So while the idea is clever, it just doesn't make much sense for something as massive as Starship. Instead, researchers found a much more practical solution called no-vent fill. Normally, when you pump cryogenic propellant into a warmer tank, some of it immediately boils into gas. The traditional solution is pretty simple. Open a vent and let that gas escape into space. The downside is you're literally throwing away fuel. No vent fill takes a smarter approach. Instead of venting the gas, the incoming propellant is cooled to an even lower temperature than normal. As this extra cold fuel enters the tank, it absorbs heat from both the warm tank walls and the gas inside. That gas then cools down enough to condense back into liquid. In other words, instead of watching your propellant disappear out of vent, you recycle most of it right back into usable fuel. Before the main transfer begins, engineers still sacrifice a small amount of propellant to chill the tank and purge any unwanted gases. Think of it like letting the cold water run for a few seconds before taking a shower. It feels a little wasteful, but it makes everything work much better afterward. And then there are the problems that only show up when your spacecraft is the size of a small skyscraper. Most spacecraft only need a few tons of propellant. Starship? It needs thousands. According to a NASA Office of Inspector General report, a single lunar mission could require roughly 15 tanker launches just to deliver enough propellant to an orbital fuel depot for one Starship. That's not one launch. That's an entire launch campaign before the real mission even begins. And getting all that fuel into orbit is only half the battle. Once it's there, someone has to keep it cold. That's an engineering challenge nobody has ever attempted on this scale. Then there's the logistics. NASA estimates SpaceX will likely need an average launch cadence of about one mission every 8 days to support this kind of operation. Now, that might sound completely insane until you remember we're talking about SpaceX. This is the same company that looked at reusable rockets, something many people thought would never be practical, and somehow turned it into their normal Tuesday. To reach that kind of flight rate, SpaceX is rapidly expanding its launch infrastructure. Starbase continues to gain new pads and upgraded facilities, while in Florida, the company is preparing additional Starship launch sites, including the former SLC-37 complex. Altogether, the long-term goal is dozens upon dozens of Starship launches every year. But perhaps the biggest improvement won't come from launching more tankers. It'll come from needing fewer of them in the first place. The planning Starship version 4 is expected to carry around 2,300 tons of propellant, significantly more than today's vehicles. If those performance targets are achieved, the number of tanker flights needed for a lunar mission could drop from around 15 to just 5 or 6. That's still a lot of launches, but it's a whole lot less crazy than 15. And perhaps the best news for SpaceX is that they have something every engineer secretly wishes for: more time. The Artemis schedule has shifted over the past few years, with the first crewed lunar landing now expected during Artemis 4 in 2028 instead of Artemis 3. That gives SpaceX a larger window to prove that Starship can repeatedly reach orbit, deploy payloads, survive long-duration missions, and, most importantly, demonstrate reliable cryogenic fuel transfer in space. After hearing all of that, it's probably easy to understand why so many people look at in-orbit refueling and say, yeah, that's never going to work. And honestly, they're not entirely wrong. This is an incredibly difficult problem. It'll take years of testing, plenty of failures, and a whole lot of engineering headaches before anyone truly masters it. But here's the thing. Some challenges aren't optional. If humanity wants to go beyond low Earth orbit on a regular basis, to build bases on the Moon, send people to Mars, or explore even farther, we eventually have to figure this out. In many ways, orbital refueling is less of a nice bonus and more of a missing piece of the puzzle. That's exactly why NASA and many commercial space companies are investing so much time and money into it. One day, spacecraft might not need all of their fuel to come from Earth. Instead, water ice mined from the Moon could be split into hydrogen and oxygen to create rocket propellant right there in space. If engineers can reliably store and transfer these super cold liquids, whether they're launched from Earth or produced somewhere else, suddenly permanent lunar bases become much more practical, and missions to Mars become far more realistic. And the possibilities don't stop there. Once you can refuel spacecraft in orbit, entirely new industries start to appear. You could have orbital fuel depots, companies whose entire business is delivering propellant, supply stations around the Moon, cargo routes between Earth and lunar orbit, and eventually even logistics networks stretching all the way to Mars. Think about how airplanes work today. A passenger jet doesn't carry enough fuel to fly everywhere it might ever need to go. It lands, refuels, and continues its journey. Spacecraft could eventually do exactly the same thing. Instead of launching with absolutely everything they'll ever need, they could stop along the way, top off their tanks, and keep going. It's a simple idea, but it completely changes what's possible. There's another reason this technology matters too. Space isn't just becoming more important for exploration, it's becoming more important for the global economy, scientific research, and national security as well. Right now, every satellite has one major limitation. Once it runs out of fuel, its useful life is basically over. But if satellites could be refueled in orbit, they could stay operational for much longer, maneuver more freely, and even be upgraded instead of replaced. That could make future satellite networks more capable, more resilient, and significantly cheaper to maintain. In a way, we're standing at another turning point in the history of spaceflight. Back in 1957, Sputnik proved that the space age had truly begun, changing the course of technology and geopolitics for decades. Today, in-orbit refueling could become one of those breakthroughs that quietly changes everything. It won't make as many headlines as a giant rocket launch. It probably won't go viral on social media. But if we ever build a future where spacecraft routinely travel between Earth, the Moon, and Mars, there's a good chance it won't be because we built bigger rockets. It'll be because we finally figured out how to fill up the tank along the way.